Hello. How's everybody doing today? Listen, Bill and Brian here, starting with a live. We got a special guest. Brian, why don't you introduce our guest?
So, listen, we're very, very fortunate today to be joined by Daniel Ramat, and Daniel is an energy expert and in security and expertise around the energy markets. So, energy security, energy fundamentals in and around the world. So, we are fortunate to be joined by him. I got the opportunity to meet Daniel in person in Fujairah last week. Was that last week, Daniel? Was that last
Yeah,
week?
it was.
Yeah, okay. It seems
Everybody,
like so
it
long
was
ago,
pleasure.
right?
It was a
Yeah.
great pleasure to meet Frank. Actually, to be honest, when I came back from Fujairah, I brought a souvenir. I got cold and I was sleeping for the whole week, so I cannot remember that it was 7 days or 5 days. By the way, I crossed it was last week.
Oh my gosh.
Oh
That
no.
I don't know if I'd call that a souvenir though. Would you call that a souvenir? That usually I think of candy or something, something sweet or a little toy for your
Ceramic
kiddos or
elephant or something, right?
yes.
I had a lot of syrups, so that maybe that was it.
So what you're saying, you brought some glass bottles back. There you go.
Yeah. Um,
Exactly.
so well, we hope you feel good. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk a little bit about some people that watch this may not understand the oil supply and demand in global sense, and that is one thing that we're gonna dive in a little bit deeper on. So I'm just gonna do some very high level education, and then we'll dive in and kind of ask some questions. Does that sound good, Daniel?
All right. Of course.
Okay,
Of course.
fantastic. So listen, first, when we look at when we look at crude oil, roughly
Mm.
the supply and demand is just over 100 million barrels a day. Some numbers have it as high as 104 million barrels a day. Some numbers have it as low as 101. Somewhere in between is our supply and demand. Now, one thing that is really fascinating to think about is over 77 million barrels a day, over 75% of of the global supply and demand on crude oil exists on water. So ships are taking crude oil from one location to another. There's some locations that have a lot of oil that other locations need a lot of oil. For example, the Middle East has a lot of excess oil that it can export into different countries, and those countries are utilizing that crude oil to grow their economies, such as China, such as India, and such as the US. The US actually imports roughly 6 million barrels a day. We do export 5 million barrels a day, but that has to do with different qualities of crude oil. So that's just a little nuance. But one reason that we wanted to have this conversation with Daniel and really talk about the energy security as well as the geopolitical implications, because his background in energy security and geopolitics is right at the center of this. Last week, for those that have totally turned off all communications and electronics, uh, uh, Iran attacked Israel, and it was a pretty dramatic show and display of an attack. And there is a lot of concern around potential retaliation. And there's been public conversations about whether Israel will attack Iran and whether it will attack how will attack, will it target oil infrastructure? Because the reason that this is important is when we talk about 75% of the global market exists on water, 20% of it flows through the Strait of Hormuz, which is right down here. As a matter of fact, this is where Daniel and I were. And if you back up, and this is marinetraffic.com for those out there, this is a great website, and it shows you in real time where these ships are and what type of ships. So these are many of them are oil tankers. I already have it pre-filtered for energy cargoes, so that it does include LNG. But as you can see, with Iran bordering this and the attack on Israel, Israel borders another area of concern, which it has to do with the Suez Canal and Sumed pipeline, which delivers from the Red Sea, and that is actually over close to 9 million barrels a day. So this conflict and this war and this has massive implications. And let me just frame this: a 1 million barrel a day supply or demand change can move crude markets by $5 to $10 a barrel. We're talking about 20 million barrels a day that go through this waterborne export region, and another 9 that goes through the Suez Canal and the Sumed, which is close in proximity to the conflict in Israel. So this has a lot of impacts. And before we go to Daniel, Bill, do you have any thoughts? Did I miss anything in that high level?
To understand, it's what's going through the Suez Canal. It's what's usually going to Europe. That's usually where they're getting their oil through, is through the Suez Canals. So you subtract some of that 9 million of that's going through the Strait of Hormuz, and the rest of it's going to the rest of the world. So such as China, India, and the U.S. And so that's sort of how that runs. I think there might be even some barrels that coming through the Suez that might make it to the U.S., but that's just basically based on the cargoes if they get rerouted in transit.
Right. And the other thing I want to say before we dive in and talk to Daniel is, feel free to, this is live. Feel free to ask your questions. We will be here and we will answer your questions for you. So Daniel, did I miss anything in kind of that recap, or is that kind of a good frame to start the discussion?
Right. Thank you guys for having me here. Look, we are in a very critical situation in the oil markets. We have a long-term, actually, let's say, problem with the supply side in oil. There has been a declining trend of investment in upstream. And in the future, we are going to have problems with supplying the energy markets, very obviously, if the countries or the governments do not make any proper decision to support the upstream sector. Apart from the energy transition, how it's going to go on, we are facing very problematic, actually, decisions, especially from the European Union, to support the upstream oil. Many European companies are now hesitating, even keeping their assets in the oil sector, to actually follow up to follow the orders from the governments for the net zero policies. Apart from this very critical issue we are having with the supply side, during the last decade, many oil producing countries, including Iran, Venezuela, Libya to some extent, and Russia, have been sanctioned. And now these sanctions have made the markets, in terms of the supply side, volatile, or at least the supply side contains remarkable uncertainty. So when we are facing any kind of geopolitical crisis, like what happened between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2022, or like what is going on now in the region, we have a big question mark whether this spare production capacity in the oil producing countries, very specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are enough to offset if any oil like that, for example, 1.9 million barrels of oil Iran has exported last month every day. So if we put this huge amount of oil out of the market, what is going to be the impact? Of course, Saudis have capacity of spare capacity, but if that is disrupted by the same actually original crisis going on, so look, the current situation is very complex. A lot of elements are involved. China, the policy of the United States, Iran, Israel, and the GCC, and also the Russians. Russians are very happy about this because the more crisis goes on, the more crisis flares up, they will be happy with the oil. They can use it again as a leverage. They can promise to take back enough oil to the market. They can use the higher prices of oil in the market to make more money. They can push actually whoever comes to the office in the States to push them for a sort of deal to make a conclusion to this energy crisis in the world. They can also do a lot of other things. For example, they can, if they want to harden the situation, they can cut the whole Kazakhstan oil going to the Black Sea through the Russian territories. 1.2 million barrels of Kazakh oil goes through the Russian territories to the Black Sea. So they have a lot of leverages, and nobody is as happy as Moscow with this. But at the same time, nobody is worried as Beijing. They're very worried about the consequences of that because they're importing a lot of oil from this region, and they're now the biggest client, the biggest buyer of the Persian Gulf oil here. So
Mm-hmm.
at the moment, I think China as the guarantee to the or the one who has supported and created the Iran-Saudi rapprochement is very concerned about the future of this crisis. But they're not going to let Iran to cut Saudi oil because they're importing 100% of Iranian oil, Iranian sanctioned oil. Iran cannot export oil to anywhere else but China. And I think Iran cannot or will very seriously hesitate touching Saudi or the UAE oil unless its whole oil export is destroyed. 90 something, let's say 95% of Iranian oil export goes from a terminal in Hark Island in the northern part of the Persian Gulf. That that port is very, very important. That was the most attacked part of this country during the 8 year war with Iraq. And if that that terminal is targeted, yes, that's there. If you can zoom it, yeah, if you can zoom in, yes, go in. Oh, that's the island. No, this is Chief. Go to the left, please.
Go to the
To the
left.
west. To the west. No, that's to the east. Go to the west. A little bit zoom up.
This one?
You can see that island. Exactly. This
There you
is
go.
Hark Island. Yeah. You cannot see any tankers around there because the AIS is off for all the tankers coming to Iran.
Sure.
By the way, yeah, if Israelis can target that oil facility, all Iranian oil will be removed from the markets. That would
Mm-hmm.
bring, I can say, at least $30 to $40 per barrel. And if that whole, and if at the moment Iran will decide whether they want to shut down the whole oil flows to let's say in some sense punish Biden administration as a retaliation for not stopping the Israelis, that would be a disaster. Iran can very easily target the Aramco oil facilities and the UAE wherever they want to use or they want to export their oils, whether in Hamria, whether in Abu Dhabi or in Fujairah. Iran can target them very easily because they're very close to the Iranian, actually mainland Iran, And also, there would be many other options, maybe closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which I don't think Iran can do it for a long time, but that would also be an option. So, yeah, we need to wait and see what would be the action of the Benjamin Netanyahu. As I know, there was very recently, maybe few less than an hour ago, a telephone conversation between Bibi and President Biden. So we need to wait for the results of that conversation. That conversation is about the scale and the points which the Israelis are going to target in retaliation to the Iran's actually missile attack on Israeli air bases and Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. So as I have heard in some British media, there is a proposal from American side to ask Israelis just to target Iranian military bases and maybe security bases to not to escalate it to energy sectors because Iran will definitely respond to whatever kind of Israeli attack to the Iranian side. If it is limited to the military, that would make sense that this attack is also again limited or in a less scale somehow to the Israeli military as well. But if they're targeting, if they target the Iranian nuclear facilities, there would be a chance for targeting Israeli nuclear facilities as well. And that would be a global disaster. And also, if they target Iranian energy sector, I think Iran will not hesitate to fire another barrage of missiles to Israeli refineries or to Israeli gas fields in the Mediterranean Sea. And nobody knows when it's going to stop them.
Yeah, Daniel, I think you make a great point, and especially with the conversation from Biden, who is the current U.S. president, and of course there is an election in what is it, 20 some odd days, so 24 days. But I think I think you touched on two things that many people miss in the energy markets. Number one is that Iran is exporting a lot of barrels, and one thing that I typically try to point out is all of these barrels. This is production for Iran. All of these barrels are under sanction, and so they've been growing the production and exporting it to areas that aren't held to those sanctions. So China is consuming Iranian oil at a discount to the market, and China's benefiting from a discounted distressed price. So that's one thing. The second thing is when you discussed that this would not be a $2, $3 move, but a $30 move. Now, this is not Brent, but this is WTI, so it's about $5, $3 to $5 less. You are talking over $100 to $110 oil, and
Yeah,
that will.
if Saudis cannot offset that very immediately, if Saudis do it, there would be less concern. But that is one of the points that Iran is just trying to push. Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs recently visited the GCC countries to ask them to not support any kind of attack to Iran, including not oversupplying or supplying the markets with extra barrels.
Yep.
Because Iran considers that as a sort of hostility or something.
Right. I think this is the center of the debate. Bill, what are you thinking here?
I think the military exercise between those two countries is going to be one of those that we watch very closely. I think there's some assumptions, some people that the U.S. can ramp up their oil. Brian, you and I know they don't have the infrastructure to be able to ramp it up much
Nope.
more than 500,000 barrels at the most.
Yep.
And the South American countries cannot, they don't have enough spare capacity. The Saudis' spare capacity, we always show to be around 2 million barrels a day at the most that they could actually get out of the ports. And so it's not going to take much of a, and Iran, as far as a producer, is not the largest producer, but their 3 million barrels makes a difference in the pricing. It's really, if there is any conflict between the Middle Eastern states themselves that affects energy infrastructure, that's almost catastrophic if we lost all 20 million barrels that come through there, or they were just held up. I don't think they go away, but they're just held up and can't get out. I think that's exactly why Saudi Arabia is looking at building the pipeline across the desert, is to be able to have some options and not be stranded in on the waterborne side of the Persian Gulf. So,
Well,
think
because both sides get relatively tricky because you have different contact points with different countries, and those different countries may be embroiled in things like Iran and Israel right now. Is Saudi
but
Arabia is yeah.
I think the catastrophic part of this is also the deterrent before to keep it from happening, because nobody can afford that to actually happen. Neither side can afford that to actually happen. So I think it has a really big deterrent between the Middle Eastern countries. I can't say the same between Israel and Iran, because that's more ideologic as opposed to practical.
Well, and that's
And
that was actually touched on, Daniel. I don't know if you caught Monday's Gulf Intelligence podcast, but Omar was on there, and I was loved listening to Omar. And Omar was really referencing, well, and I tend to believe his thesis, and his thesis is, if this escalates in the way that has been discussed in some circles, I mean, we're not talking about a $20, a $30 move. We are talking about not $100 oil, but 200, 300, and economies collapse. I mean, this could, this is part of the reason that we started the exercise recognizing over 75% of the global supply and demand exists on ships. And those ships go through different areas, and the Strait of Hormuz is over 20% of the global supply and demand. That is right at the center of the reason, and part of the reason I'm glad that you pointed out this this island right here, and how that plays into things. So I'm if you were to put on a forecasting hat, do you think a diplomatic solution is possible?
Uh, to be honest, I believe that Bibi is trying to use the current situation to impact the U.S. elections,
Hmm.
and
Okay.
this is what President Biden did not reject. He didn't confirm it, but he said that if I was in Bibi's shoes, I wouldn't do so. So I think Bibi tries to impact the U.S. elections, but I can say he's a wise politician. He knows that whatever he does with this current situation would not guarantee a success for his actually for the candidate he wants to help him to get in the office. Whoever comes to the office, Bibi should work with. So I think he will use this leverage as for getting some some advantages from the next president, whoever he or she is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he will decide if even if he wants to actually touch the Iranian energy industry or energy infrastructure. There are a lot of other weaknesses in Iranian industry which he can touch. In the last summer, we had something about, despite very huge amount of generated electricity in the country, we had about 25% of electricity deficit in the summer. In the winter, despite producing 850 million cubic meters of natural gas every day, actually the refined gas, I mean, the sour gas is more, 850 million cubic meters of refined gas Iran produces every day. In the winter, we had 340 something million cubic meters of gas deficit in Iran. Other sectors, we have a lot of deficit due to very, very cheap energy prices in the country. Also, very huge demand in the country due to a lot of reasons. So we had little investment due to the sanctions, high demand due to the low prices. Considering all these, considering 20, 30 million liters of gasoline deficit in Iran, despite, as again, huge amount of domestic production, I can guess that maybe Benjamin Netanyahu would decide to target a refinery, for example, Abadan refinery, with the capacity of 600,000 barrels per day,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe he decides to target a big power plant. The best choice would be Damovan power plant close to Tehran with 1,500 megawatts of production, megawatt per hour of production. That would be a big shock to the grid. Also, he can target the gas refineries, which are not going to impact the global energy markets.
Hmm.
If he wants to target Iranian energy infrastructure. Sorry, I'm still sick.
Still recovering. It's still recovering
Yeah,
from your
still
souvenir.
yeah, yeah. And the problem is when you go to the Middle Eastern countries, when they figure you're a Middle Eastern, everybody, the men kiss you. So yeah, so I kiss people from Singapore to Egypt. So that's maybe I had a souvenir from I don't know where. So by the
Yeah,
way, so
it's
he
from
has a lot
somewhere.
of
It's an
summer.
international.
Yes,
It's an international cold.
international. Yes,
Daniel,
and
I personally blame Brian.
He
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 he,
he
he
has his
blames me
impact on
for
people.
everything. He's going to
sorry.
blame me for everything. So yeah, Bill's saying that I'm responsible. So my apologies. I'm sorry, Daniel.
No, actually, I'm shocked at how you didn't get that. Anyway, so right, so he has a lot of other choices. So because please consider that Netanyahu in this very specific situation is is playing to some extent while considering the war in Ukraine and the
Mm,
constraints of the United States in the war in Ukraine, because your first priority is to stop the Russians.
right.
Iran, by any chance or by any means, is or can be considered as a potential threat to the interest of the United States. But Russians are a very practical and active threat to the interest of the West. Iran would one day build a nuclear weapon. Russians have the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons.
Right.
Iran would one day attack the territories of NATO or your allies. Russians have already attacked Ukraine and they're threatening NATO that if you come in, we will do this or that. So Russians are the real threat, And Iran is a very small scale of that threat, or I can say an extension of that threat in the region. So Benjamin Netanyahu considers that whatever which will make the US military or US intelligence over busy here should be resolved very immediately. So when somebody should make a decision and you cannot leave Israel alone, you can get more from the states. At the same time, Vladimir Putin will be very happy with the extension of this conflict, that both Iran and Israel are, let's say, somehow trying to actually test their chance to see what will come next. Because, that is a very fundamental issue. Israel lacks a soft power in this region, and that is very genetic. The DNA of that country and its surrounding countries are different. Israel has a DNA, a Western, let's say, DNA with the Zionist ideology, and Arab countries around that are majority Sunnis with no room for actually anything else. Even the Shia groups in Lebanon are not very welcomed in their own country. Iran has some levels of soft power in Lebanon, between the Shia population of Lebanon, between the Shia population of Syria, between the Shia population of Iraq, and among the Shia population of Yemen. So countering Iran has some tools to counter Israel, and this is an artificial crisis. This does not come from the real geopolitics, because Iran. Hello, I think.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, good. So this artificial conflict, they have some leverages, and since Israel lacks a soft power in this region, they need to expose their hard power to actually support their own security, or to develop their interest in the region, to promote their interests in the region. Iran also has some weaknesses, because Iran is a Shia country with the majority of the Sunni people around it, but limited number of countries have Shia population, and in most of which Iran has created its own proxies. This network of proxies with big propaganda system in Iran, together with hard power, these are the two different models Iran and Israel are fighting. For a lot of reasons I can explain in another session, I think. By the way, I don't believe that. So if I want to get to a sort of conclusion, I don't believe that Benjamin Netanyahu can 100% close its eyes on the interests of the Democratic Party in the States.
Right.
Also, they cannot forget about China, because China is also very concerned about it.
Yep.
The reason you cannot see the Chinese Navy in the Red Sea is not because they are not concerned about it. It's because they don't want to lose their allies in Iran, but they're just pushing Iran with threatening importing less or more oil. The one which has secured the flow of oil through the Red Sea, if you can show your map again, you can see that tankers are going through north to south of the Red Sea. No, not this one, the one in the west of Saudi Arabia. Yes, yeah, you can see that is not the military coalition. That is the push from China, which pushed Iranian Navy to come out, which used to serve the Yemeni Houthis with intelligence.
Okay.
So China is very concerned. Israel cannot close its eyes on them. At the same time, Iran cannot start actually hell day with destroying the whole infrastructure of oil of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. A huge amount, let me tell you, a super huge amount of Iranian oil revenue comes to the UAE and Oman, and then from that system is delivered to Iran, and the US is very well aware of that. Money, hard currency, is exchanged from yuan to US dollar or to euro in these countries, and hard currency is delivered to Afghanistan and north of Iraq, and then that's how they deliver it to Iran. So the big network of the exchanges, also the ship to ship, big amount of ship to ship happens in the UAE waters. Huge amount of Iran exports about 200 something barrels of refined products
Well,
to
if all these are sanctioned barrels and they're not tracked, they're transferring somewhere, and the ship to ship is very much likely, because you roughly have close to 1.4 million barrels a day of sanctioned crude oil that is leaving. It is exiting Iran. So, because you mentioned before, I think domestic demand is maybe a million to
no,
one
no, no,
point
it's about one point. Yeah, no, it's 1.8 million.
1.8
But
million.
recently some barrels were added to that, I think 1.9. And
Okay.
also we have, based on Kepler, Iran's export was 1.7, but domestic sources tell me that it was 1.9.
Okay.
So adding to that is 200,000 barrels of refined product, which makes the total something maximum 2.1 million barrels, which
Okay.
is almost equal to pre-sanction levels. So the majority of that refined products goes to the majority of that go to the UAE,
Okay.
and then it is exported from UAE or Oman to other countries. So you see,
So
Iran's actually
they're basically washing the barrels. In other words, they come out, they go through another spot, and then they're exported because there's no serial numbers on them, obviously, but they're actually washing the barrels to where you don't know where that oil came from, correct?
right. They're washing the barrels, but everybody
Eh,
is aware of where they're going because many companies like Kepler, Ortexa, FGE, tanker trackers, everybody can easily follow those barrels, and they have monthly reports that very can almost show you every drop of Iranian oil destination. There are some other things you need to consider that recently, after President Biden administration, the amount of floating reserves of Iran declined from 100 million barrels in total to less than 20 million barrels. That means Iran has despite increased production levels, Iran has much less problems with finding, actually marketing its oil. That is not all due to the Biden policies, which I can say big part of that is, but the second reason is Iran has created or expanded its network of bypassing the sanctions, especially in China and also in the UAE. And the contract between, the funny point, Brian, for
yes, sir.
during the Fujairah Accord was, as you remember, they said Iranians are not allowed for the boat tour. Well, the majority of not a majority, but a big part of that oil in those tankers are Iranian oil. That's super funny.
that's that's ironic, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
a
it is.
little but I understand there's different thought processes and different I, I I get why they have that, but it's interesting, and part of the reason, Daniel, I greatly appreciate what you just shared with us, because that is amazing insight. And I will say that it definitely,
You're very
this conflict, especially it when you talk about the influence on the U.S. elections, is very much in the center of the discussion, because there's a lot of debate within the United States about our alliance and support of Israel. And it's really, there is a lot of questions about that from the public. And there is a lot of questioning that is going on about that policy and about that support. So, and rightfully so, because this is a very difficult situation, and for the U.S. and the U.S. elections, I think it is having an impact. But I will say,
Right.
public opinion here, I'd say probably, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, probably 2 or 3 years ago, the United States is just aligned with Israel, and now that's being brought into question. Would you agree with that, Bill?
I agree with, but I don't think it's as big as you think it is. I think it's visible. I think we're getting a lot of press on it because it's never really happened before. But I don't think it's as widespread as people would think that it is. We have a problem in in the U.S. with our media, and the fact that and you know the term has always been, if it bleeds, it leads, and so it's all the anything that's a flash in a pan, everybody wants to see, and so that just consumes our media. But if it's when you start talking about the kind of discussions that we were just having, Daniel, that doesn't ever make it to the media because it can't be said in a 20-second, spot.
Soundbite. Yeah.
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 So I think we see it. I think we see more of it than we've ever seen before. But I don't think it the actual percentage of people who are against or for Israel either way has changed all that much. I just think it's more visible.
Right. Yep.
But apart from why the States is supporting Israel, assuming that you have to, or that is the policy to support Israel, or you don't have any other choice. What Benjamin Netanyahu is doing right now with the elections in the States is very, very much. Uh, Let me go back to one point. Chinese imported a lot. They have been importing huge amounts of oil without any need for that, or without any market for that. And that was a big question mark, and why they are doing so. They just had somehow predicted a sort of flare up in this current situation. So they did like this, and everybody could predict that the situation in the Middle East, with a lot of actually elements showing that both sides, I mean, Iran and its proxies and Israel, are not getting to an end in this current situation, could be predictable. But what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing right now with the elections in the U.S. is very wise. Imagine that you're the Democratic Party. The policy of President Biden was to support Israel
Right.
as much as possible with giving them weapons, to have a leverage on them to control them. That was the idea behind supplying them with a lot of weapons. That if you let them alone, and if they feel they're alone, they would do whatever they want to do, or whatever they think it is necessary. Well, when they consider the US as a very huge back or huge support to their military campaign here, they would be very much relying on the States, so they would make their decisions based on the green lights receiving from Washington, D.C. But now, in this very critical moment, the game is changing. The game has changed. The question is it possible for a U.S. administration not to support Israel in the case they are in the middle of a conflict, in the middle of a clash, or let's say war, with a country which is not any popular, and which is known for being a terrorist attack or a source of exporting terrorism or whatever to the region? And now a big part of the population and a huge, actually, number of politicians and the rich guys there are supporting Israel. So, by any means, if you do not support Benjamin Netanyahu in his war with Iran, you will not be elected next term. But if you support him, because he has leverages, including becoming known as a victim of the looseness of the Democratic Party.
Mm.
Second one, actually, is to targeting the oil infrastructure in Iran, which would encourage Iran to target the Saudi oil infrastructure at the end, if Iran considers that as the end of the game, and that would bring a disaster to the actually energy markets in the states as well, and
Well,
that
because
will end up.
it brings China back into view, because if that infrastructure, and that's part of the reason that this is such a critical spot. And listen, what probably from here we're probably going to kind of wrap up, because I think we could probably, Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, we could probably talk for 2 weeks and not have it solved.
Absolutely, absolutely right.
If we-
Fact is,
You're
if the three of us
right.
can get it solved, we are grossly underpaid.
Well, any closing thoughts before we kind of wrap up? We haven't received any questions, and folks out there, feel free to ask any questions. If you do have questions, hit us up. We'll be happy to respond and get to them. Any closing thoughts on where we might go from here?
I I think if Iranian oil infrastructure is targeted, and if Iranian oil is cut, I'm not speaking about natural gas. I'm not speaking about refineries nor the electricity generation sector. If the crude oil flows stops, and if Iran considers that as a sort of end point, and by any chance targets the Saudi Aramco or ADNOC in the UAE, the war in Ukraine will become to an end under Trump administration with with uh, peace for land actually gain, and the winner will be Vladimir Putin.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a good forecast. Well, listen, Daniel, thank you so much. Really appreciate your insight. I'm looking forward to talking to you again, and I'm really happy that we got to meet in person, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon. So thank you, Bill. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I tell you what, it's interesting that the whole world runs off energy, right? I mean, that's exactly what's going on. That's why these, when I look at that shipping deal, I almost look at it almost like a body, and that's all the blood that's flowing through to all the different countries to be able to keep them alive. And so, any kind of interruption of that will cause a problem. And I think it's important to be aware of what's going on, because some of these will have greater consequences for some countries
Mm,
than for others.
right.
And so, it doesn't take a little bit of oil to get everybody upset. I mean, we see what 1 million barrels does in the United States market. It'll change it by $5, $10. Can't imagine what 5 million would do, or 10 million would do, or even 20 million would do.
It would be a
And
shock.
so it would be, I mean, we see some countries literally go under, would just almost cease to exist. And so, so anyway, so it's very important things. Listen, Daniel, it's been great picking your brain. I certainly appreciate that. You've got a lot of expertise in this that sometimes I feel like that, as old as I am, I haven't seen anything yet compared to what's going on in the rest of the world. And so it's good to get that perspective. We do want to have you back and talk even more about the volatility, not just in the price, but in the delivery systems of the crude oil.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And so Daniel, thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you,
I
Brian. It
hope
was a
he's
great
feeling
pleasure
better.
being with you. Thank you. Sure.
As we
Yeah.
say, take some more of that medicine, because it's better living through chemistry.
Right.
Well, listen, folks,
Very good.
thank you Daniel, thanks so much. We look forward to chatting with you soon. And folks, if you're curious about Bill and myself, we are with a company called energyrogue, energyrogue.com, and we track energy markets and provide insight into crude oil, natural gas liquids, refined products, and electricity in the U.S. markets, as well as some international markets, and we do that very affordably. So if you're curious, go to energyrogue.com, or you can reach out to us at brian@energyrogue.com or bill@energyrogue.com. So Daniel, thank you again. And I hope you get some rest.
Thank you very much. Sure. Yeah, I think this is coming the time to go to bed here in Tehran. And yeah, it was a great pleasure being with you guys. Bill, Brian, it was a great pleasure. I hope to be with you again.
Yes.
All right. We'll
Thanks
see
so
you,
much.
Daniel.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.